Hello everyone. In the last video we ended with talking about treatment. So we looked at what defines abnormal behavior and how does treatment come into play. Well, we talked about Jerome Frank's essential features of therapy. I'm not going to go over that again since we just watched it. But I will progress to how abnormality as viewed and treated in the past. So abnormality as viewed and treated in the past. We are going to look at what I did was I kind of made a little cheat sheet. I hope this is visible enough for you all. Whoops. Let me go back. There we go. Where I put general time periods as listed in our text, as well as prevalent beliefs and methods to curing people from their psychological abnormalities, as well as prominent people that were listed in that specific chapter. So what I really want to focus on, again, I think the chapter does a really good job of labeling the progression and how we've gotten to where we are concerning abnormal behavior and how it's viewed. So I won't go too much in depth about it because you are going to read it. But I think it's important to see the ebbs and the flows of our views. For example, in the prehistoric Stone Age, it could date as early as the Stone Age, but was also seen in Egyptian, Chinese, and Hebrew records. Prevalent beliefs, abnormality in behavior, thoughts, and cognitions stemmed from magical beings who controlled the world. So it may be something like of a god figure as well, or Satan. So sometimes abnormal behaviors were seen as demonic possession. The body was a battleground between good and evil, so you had to force or release the demons out. A common method that we've seen, and you may have heard about in your Psych 150, depending on who you had, is trephination. It's basically drilling holes or hitting holes into someone's skull in an attempt to release the evil spirits. Okay, exorcisms were also popular in doing different methods to try to get demons out. This could be praying. This could be, beating the body, making the body not a wanted temple for that demonic spirit. Well, we find that with the Greeks and the Romans in as early as 500 BC, they kind of looked at a more, I would say this is like the first time we see a somatogenic perspective. So looking at the body's causes, like physical causes for abnormalities. So it started with Hippocrates he believed that this imbalance of 4 fluids in our body, yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. If you had an imbalance in those fluids, it may lead to abnormal behavior. Which, if you think about back in the beginning of Psych 150, we talk about neurotransmitters, right? There are chemicals in the body that are responsible for different emotions, right? I hear a joke on that the people say now, thanks for my daily dose of serotonin, right? Serotonin makes us happy. So it's not too far off from what we've actually found using biopsychological studies, but it doesn't catch on till much later. So I just think that's interesting to note. And so what they did was the ancient Greeks and Romans would look at methods like suggesting a quiet life, certain methods of bleeding, dietary changes, like I think it said going on a diet of vegetables, and even celibacy, or choosing to not have sex. And these different things was like their own form of therapy. And we're going to see how that changes, of course. In the Middle Ages in Europe, we see this resurgence of demonological views and practices. So back what we saw in the prehistoric times. So the religious institutions took hold of the area and controlled a lot of the government and science and kind of influenced different practices. And so that could be a reason that this spread in Europe in the Middle Ages. And so we see that kind of medical view resurgence. I'm sorry, that should not say medical view resurgence. I'm going to fix that on your PowerPoint. This is more looking at, that point, just ignore that. I'm going to take that out. Just the resurgence of demonological view and practices. So we're back to seeing kind of making the body an unwanted place for demons to dwell. So this is like the whipping, bleeding, self-flagellation, those kind of methods. In the Renaissance, this is when we see the medical view resurgence. So this should be kind of this should be moved down because it's between, it's at the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the Renaissance. So just note that this is at the end of the Middle Ages. The medical view. I pointed with my finger. How silly of me. End of the Middle Ages, beginning of the Renaissance. So what's important with the Renaissance, though, is that we see a surge of humane and loving approaches. And this is very important because this is where a lot of modern methods have been adapted from. And it started with John Weyer. So he is considered the founder of modern psychopathology. He was one of the first people to develop an asylum. And so, what do you think of when you hear of an asylum? Take a minute. Some people think like, ooh, lobotomies, torture, all those nasty devices they would put people in, insulin comas. Okay, they have a really bad rap, but initially they started as a place to specifically house people with psychological disorders and treat them with love and care. Unfortunately, with funding and different things, as we'll see in the 19th century and early 20th century in Europe as well as the United States, they began to get overcrowded far too quickly, understaffed, and short of money. And so with that, the conditions for treating these people went significantly downhill. In the 19th century, we see that moral treatment that we talked about with the Renaissance kind of have an uptick again, but as well as reversal because of the reasons I stated earlier. They were understaffed, there were far too many people, they grew too quickly, there were money shortages, and more effective treatment was needed. That's what I say with TX. That just stands for treatment. That's what I'm using for treatment. So, while treating people kindly and humanely may help with some psychological disorders, it doesn't help with some, and especially the more severe ones. You have to use an array of therapeutic methods. But some popular names. So Philippe Pinel, he was the chief physician of La Bicêtre, I can't speak French, but it was in Paris, France. And it was one of the first kind of like asylums, shrines in the area to treat people with that human moral treatment. And this kind of spread, you have William Tukey in the York Retreat in England, as well as Benjamin Rush in the United States, often considered the father of American psychiatry. Those first three names are large figures in abnormal psychology that promoted this idea of moral treatment. And then you have Dorothy Dix. She was a campaigner for reform. While she wasn't a psychologist or psychiatrist herself, she sought kind of, she went from legislator to legislator to help fund these different asylums to help people with psychological disorders so they wouldn't be just dumped in to hospitals, for example. So they could have their own section and we can fund them and help them accordingly. And that led to the creation of state hospitals for those people. Now, the early 20th century, this is where we see the prevalence of the beliefs in somatogenic perspective and psychogenic perspective. And these kind of deviate. They combat one another. So somatogenic, think body, soma. Soma means body. So we see physical causes for abnormal behaviors, emotions, and thinking. So some prevalent methods to solve this was a lobotomy, which was sometimes putting an ice pick in someone's nose and hammering away to scramble part of their brain. I will say it did work. They stopped engaging in those behaviors, but they also, had brain damage. So that's not really helping, right? And then there's forced eugenic sterilization. Sometimes they would force these people to not be able to have children or reproduce. So not exactly a shining moment in psychology, but it has to be talked about to talk about the humaneness and, empathy that we practice in today's age. And then there's a psychogenic perspective. Psyche means mind. So think of the psychological roots for these problems. And one of the first treatments was hypnotism, which if you hear this name Frederick Mesmerized, think of mesmerized. That stems from his name. He was a hypnotist in Austria, and he claimed to cure a good amount of people through these hypnotic means. Now, he himself was kind of a huckster, I guess, but the method did work on some people. It's affected by, we talk about this in my consciousness unit in Psych 150. It's affected by how suggestible someone is and if they'll be receptive to that treatment. So, but this kind of started this whole idea of kind of like meditation, for example. We kind of see these branches of different methods to address the psychological roots of the problem. And other big names, of course, Joseph Brauer was very involved with the psychogenic perspective, and that is who Sigmund Freud branched onto in looking at the psychoanalytic perspective, which we're going to talk about more. I know this is a lot of information, but again, y'all should be reading your text, so hopefully this won't be confusing to you. But Sigmund Freud, this is a big name, and if you've had me before, you know I talk about Freud all the time. So huge name in psychoanalytic perspective, looking at the unconscious mind and how those unconscious desires or experiences affect our present experiences. For example, childhood trauma. That's where we get this idea from. Recent decades and current trends. So major changes have occurred, but stigmas still exist. In your text, it talks about, through different surveys, large percentage of people, like 40%, still believe that people with psychological disorders bring it on themselves. People with psychological disorders have those disorders because of sins they've committed. And people with psychological disorders, oh shoot, what was the third one? It was really interesting. So bring it on themselves. Now I gotta look at the page number. Excuse me while I look this up. 31% consider disorders to be a sign of personal weakness. Now, as you see, these are very negative, I will say, from, that is my perspective of this, because they inhibit how we view psychological disorders, which can inhibit how someone seeks help. So you may know someone who may have wanted to go to therapy, but they were underage and their parents didn't believe in it, or believe there's some kind of shame with going to therapy. There are still a lot of hurdles we're trying to move past, but I feel like especially Gen Z becoming very receptive and open about their experiences with mental health. Or maybe my perspective is just skewed because of the TikTok. Anyway, but there have been methods to kind of prevent abnormal behaviors or kind of track it before it starts. Now, obviously, we can't prevent abnormal behavior from occurring 100% because sometimes people just have biological structures that don't I'm sorry, my cat was scratching my door, distracted me, that don't favor them in terms of when they face stressful events. Maybe they're pre-programmed to have a little more fight or flight response, right? But we're trying to look at maybe social factors that lend themselves to people having psychological disorders. So if you find a trend that people born to teenage mothers tend to be more depressed, now that's not exactly the statistic. I'm kind of making that up. But people born to teenage mothers tend to have more chances of having a psychological disorder, not specifically depression, but different ones. Then we'll try to do intervention programs to help teenage mothers, maybe in facilitating behaviors that will help their child's growth and development. So that maybe using harmful means such as physical punishment aren't used. So different community-based programs to help people. Also, and recently with the passage of the ACA, that wasn't recently, but, more recent than the other things we're talking about. Mental health is considered an essential health benefit, which previously it wasn't. And so that insurance coverage helps people to be able to access the mental health services they need. Approximately 60% of people who have mental health issues are able to go and seek treatment each year in the United States because of different reasons. But I'm sure the ACA having this as an essential health benefit helps them. Then we also have, for severe disturbances and less severe disturbances, how are people helped? Psychotropic medications, we're going to talk about that. Anti-anxiety meds, antidepressants, deinstitutionalization. So institutions aren't used as often as they were, when asylums were the big thing. A lot of things are lower numbers, and so if someone's institutionalized, It's not like how it was in the horror movie or American Horror Story season 2, okay? And then we have limitations, fewer resources though, and people living in decrepit situations, poverty, homelessness, and prisons. So a lot of times these people with severe disturbances maybe can't afford to go to an institution or don't have the appropriate coverage with insurance to go. And so that was the supplementary resource I provided in our folder this week that talks about, how a lot of people are circulating through jail, because of their severe mental health illness. They're viewed as criminals and how that contributes to their situations. So it's really a shame how that's kind of spun out of control in the United States. But for less severe disturbances, we're able to provide psychotherapy and specialized programs. So private psychotherapy is just, when you go to the therapist for your weekly appointment, usually sometimes you get some insurance coverage to help pay for that. And specialized programs could be something like the National Suicide Hotline, for example. That's a specialized program put in place to help people from committing suicide. So usually if someone that is having suicidal thoughts or ideations, you can call the hotline and they give you specific instructions as to how to prevent that. Or they'll talk the person kind of down from that, and call the appropriate resources. So different programs like that, are helping to diminish like the suicide rate. So we're trying to go for prevention because it's always better to be proactive than reactive. Current trends. These are just some of the influential perspectives we see present in abnormal psychology. Psychoanalytic, looking at a lot of unconscious biases or unconscious mind. This can be biases, these can be repressed trauma, very Freudian. Biological, so how our biological structures play into our neurochemical makeup and how that affects our thoughts and behaviors. Cognitive behavioral, how our thoughts affect our behaviors, behaviors affect our thoughts. Humanistic existential, what part does free will and the human spirit kind of play into this? Sociocultural, how does our culture affect our views of behavior? Like we said, it's circumstantial. Our behavior is deviating from norms. As well as developmental psychopathology. And I just included this table of mental health professionals in the United States because I think it's important to differentiate. Psychiatrists are medical doctors. They go on after medical school to study psychiatry. They can give medications and diagnose abnormalities. Psychologists may have a PhD or a PsyD. They're trained in therapeutic techniques. So they go specifically to a PsyD program. They are not medical doctors, but they do have doctorates. Social workers and counselors usually tend to have a master's degree, and they're going to help a lot with problems of life. So this could be maybe someone's just having stress from their work or in their marriage. This is not exactly an abnormal psychological disorder, but a problem with their living. So there are differences. In technology and mental health, I'll be quick on this one. Just the digital world is providing a trigger for abnormal behavior. It's addictive. There's opportunities for bullying through social media, as well as social pressures and anxiety that lend themselves to one's anxiety. Maybe someone has an eating disorder. Well, social media may flood them with images of the body images and what they should look like, right? People blame social media for a lot of things, but it has been supported that it is a trigger for this abnormal behavior. As well as telemental health. We're seeing a surge in this, especially with the pandemic, so it's really interesting to see how that works. But we're also able to access people's mental health from afar with not necessarily needing face-to-face contact. So it also helps people. It's the good and bad, the give and the take. And again, this is just important to understand the past to inform the present and future progress. So if you have any questions, let me know. I know these videos were a bit longer than I meant to make, and I'm really sorry. But I just get really excited talking about these things with you. And remember, for this module, there is no assignment due except to complete the introductory assignment, which you would have done to see this movie. But I will post next week's assignment so you can get started. Y'all have a great week, and let me know if you have any questions.